Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. I hope you watched my last video because it's going to be relevant. If not, the pop-up will appear somewhere around here. But what happened right now, today, is absolute slam dunk of a banger that Ukraine delivered to us on this day. In the area of Kherson, the southern area here on the left bank, three Russian bombers were taken out by a Patriot missile defense system, which is great news because these planes were used by Russians all the time to bombard the bridgehead that Ukrainians are having on this part of the river bank. And I was talking about in the last video that one of the major parts of Ukrainian offensive is to push the artillery away from the river to make sure that artillery is beyond the reach, and that would allow the Ukrainians to establish heavy-duty connections between the different sides of the river and deliver a lot of heavy equipment en masse. Now, the question on that video that was left hanging was, what will Ukraine do with the aviation component of the Russians? Because Russians still had the helicopters and they still had the aviation bombs that were used to destroy Ukrainian transportation and assets. And as per requested, Ukrainians delivered specifically the answer to that question. They've put in a Patriot missile defense system. They didn't just put it and started shooting down everything. They hunted specifically for planes. So, and this kind of goes well hand in hand with what we saw previously also before the last episode, where Ukrainians also took additional drone strike in the area right over here. Sorry, you cannot see it. In the area right over here, where they struck the airport with Russian bombers. So Ukraine is starting to go starting going after the Russian air assets, which is great because that will pretty much enable the whole plan that we talked about last time. Again, I want to underscore that while maybe the plan will not work, maybe Russia will get some kind of idea, we do see that the plan is there and we see Ukraine working towards that plan succeeding. So for now, this is where we at, and we have unfortunately a lot more news to cover. So for the map update, it's going to be everything, but it's definitely not everything for the important news, because one of the major news today was that the Dutch are already considering the first 18 F-16 planes to be delivered to Ukraine. That is massive. It's an additional both strike and air defense capabilities that Ukraine will get. It will be a significant boost if we're talking about for an area of Kherson. Those can be used to challenge a lot of Russian air power, effectively enabling a lot of that potential for the offensive for Ukrainians on the Kherson left bank. This is great news, and this definitely brings possibilities to the table. Will or not, there will be, we'll see. But for potential for the future, it's definitely good. But the main kind of news that is happening right now is we see Russia being squeezed on the economic fronts, something that we don't usually cover a lot on this channel. I mostly focus on the map updates and so on, but the question of sanctions, how well they're working, what economic challenges Russia is really having, it's not really discussed as much. And I think it's a good place to talk about this, because Russia is having a significant squeeze applied to it from the Biden administration, from US specifically. They are actually putting a lot of pressure on the banks from the Western countries that are working still with Russia to try to see if they can put some kind of pressure and some kind of timeline for these banks that are financing Russians within Russia to get out of Russia, which would be great. That means less money available for the Russian economy, less money in operation, less working economy. Beyond that, there's a fight on the Russian oil because of the sanctions that now are starting to be imposed. a little bit of deviation here. A lot of times we talk about that sanctions that are put on Russia don't work, and it's a valid point. But it doesn't make that doesn't take away that the sanctions by themselves are good. The ideas behind the sanctions, the way that they have been proposed and accepted, is great. It's only about getting them to work. That's the ultimate question. For a longer time, it felt that just because we are within this Western hemisphere, because like we're the money center of the world in the West with the European Union and the United States, it felt like if we don't want something, then kind of our agents all over the world would kind of respect that, and then they will not try to go around it, which in reality obviously didn't really pan out exactly like this. So we actually we need to pay attention to what exactly are we doing and how we're reinforcing the sanctions, which is great. And now we see, because of US starting to impose secondary sanctions on specific oil companies, this happened specifically after a big investigation and reveal about the Russian shadow fleet. We see both EU starting to impose sanctions for Denmark and other countries to check the Russian Navy, this secret fleet of theirs, of all their oil tankers, to be checked whether or not they're selling Russian oil at the higher prices. Also, US imposing secondary sanctions on companies that are working with this dirty Russian oil. And now the reports are there are many of these old tanker ships that are now not being accepted to the Indian harbors. So India is not accepting that dirty Russian oil that came in. And that's a massive problem. That's a massive problem, because if the oil doesn't sell, that's a big problem for Russians. They have put a lot of expectations for the next year's budget, that they're going to double or even triple the income for their budget. And the fact that they were able to salvage this year's budget, because if you remember, at the start of the year, there was always the talks about Russian deficit just running rampant. And it was true, because the imposed cap for the price of oil that Russian oil would sell would put serious jeopardy for the Russian budget. However, because they found some gray schemes, they were able to kind of work around it and get around it and get some of that big dirty money into the country. Now the situation kind of flips on its heads, and now Russians are really starting to sweat again, because that means imbalanced budget, no income. Already right now there's problems, but we're going to touch on Russian economy just a little bit later. But second major part of the Russian economy is gas. And gas is a big problem for Russia, because there is just no way to sell it. Russia is selling most of their gas through the pipes. Majority of the gas was sold through the pipes to European Union. That was their main market of consumption of their gas. Things happened, if you note that European Union completely decoupled themselves from the Russian gas industry within a year. Now there is very little to know, except maybe Hungary, of countries that are inside of EU that are still using Russian gas, which is great. And obviously Russia said, well, that's fine. Then instead we will sell it to China, and we will try to, do it this way. We don't actually need the European markets. You know, Russia is a pretend state, so they try to pretend that everything is fine and dandy and working great. The problem with that was that they started to sell to China, and they didn't publish the price at which they sell the gas to China. The problem of their machinations is that they still posted the total income that they got for gas sales, and they posted the total amounts sold to China, which with a little bit of math, you can kind of divide one on the other, and you can easily understand what is the approximate price of gas that they're selling to China. And the prices were awful. They were almost 2 times discounted that they were selling to China. And the second big problem was that they do not have the capacity. While going into Europe, they had multiple channels, multiple high capacity pipelines that were going straight into the European Union, and they were able to sell a lot of gas through these pipes. To China, they have one project, that pipe that was built, and then they have second that was supposed to be built but was never agreed upon. So there is only one pipe that was already working pretty much at capacity. A big project that Russia started to try to salvage it all is to build liquefied natural gas terminals. So they try to say, okay, if we cannot sell it by pipes, let's just invest into the liquefied gas industry, and we will instead sell the liquefied gas to then China or whatever, everywhere around the world. The problem, unfortunately, unfolded when Russia started trying to set up this terminal. Big project, a lot of money. Everyone was saying that this is going to solve pretty much all of the issues of selling the gas for Russia, and it turned out that it's exactly what we all were expecting. Because Russia just don't have the components, because Russia does not have the contractors, the Western companies that have the technology and the capabilities to work with the liquefied gas technologies, the project is pretty much frozen and dead in the water. They just barely announced that the project is not going to the plan. There is no completion date in sight. There is no understanding whether or not it can be completed and working. So no liquefied natural gas for Russia. They will not be selling and increasing their sales to anywhere. So they're still going to be fully dependent on China, on that small, narrow part of the gas that they're selling at a huge discount. Huge loss for Russia. Beyond that, US is additionally considering to put more pressure on the European allies, specifically because of a lot of Russian central banks assets right now are being held in Europe and Western countries. And we've been kind of over these assets for the last 2 years pretty much. But I think right now, because Biden's administration is struggling getting the projected money from the budget of the United States being allocated to support Ukraine, additional effort has been assigned to make sure that these assets are released to Ukraine, either in a form of you get to do with these assets what you want, or in a form that the dividends from these assets, because like they're still making profits, these frozen assets, and then Ukraine just gets the profits from these assets. So there are certain ways how it can be done. And the news are that US lawyers were able to find some kind of legal framework, because why is there a problem with releasing them? The problem is because we in a Western world, we're lying to pretend with the rule of law. Despite the fact that Russia broke every single rule that we had in our international law, we are still adhering to our standards, stating if it's a private, even if it's a criminally owned capital property, it's still a private property, so we cannot just confiscate and use it, which is a little bit silly, because if we already are freezing them, then there is not much difference. Like it still cannot be used, right? Because the argument goes like, oh, if we just seize assets, then none of the other dictators or other countries will feel safe investing into our banks. And firstly, I think it's a very flawed argument on its head. But secondly, if we're freezing already these assets, then dictators already don't kind of have the ability to own it. So yeah, like the message that I think we should be saving is like, you can invest assets into our economies, but don't invade other democratic countries, or you're going to get screwed. So I think it's fully justified by the morality principle to get these assets to Ukraine. And most important for us with this is that US now is heavily pressuring, and if there is indeed a framework, then Ukraine would be a great boon of receiving those 300 billions of assets to do either to their economy, to boost their production, to boost the rejuvenation of their economy, and potentially also military. Like you can buy a lot of stuff for 300 billion, a lot of military equipment that pretty much can determine the outcome of the war really, really fast. Beyond that, there is a discussion about the 50 billion on Hungary. There is a discussion about applying the Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union. Article 7 suspends the voting rights of the country, so so Hungary technically will still stay part of the European Union, but the voting rights will be taken away. It's going to be discussed in details next year, but it's a complicated procedure, and I think it's more about sending a message to Orban that it's being taken seriously, that like it's helping Ukraine is a serious deal. So I think that I don't think that the Article 7 will be triggered. I will be surprised if it will, and if it will be unanimity, because the problem with Article 7 is that it requires unanimity. So before that, Poland was there for Hungary to protect its six. Now there are Austria, there is Slovakia, so there are other actors that might not fully support the implementation of Article 7. But I think the talks around it is very crucial for Hungary, and I think that's the message that was trying to be sent. But talking about Russian economy, inflation in Russia is really, really high. Official bank inflation is I believe 7 to 8%, something around that. However, there was independent studies that actually, instead of taking like all of the production and like taking the inflation, they took more of a consumer basket production. They literally just accumulated about 1,000 or a couple of thousands of actual checks of peoples of Russia that were buying stuff, and they were able to then check up on the inflation based by those actual checks. And that showed that inflation in Russia, the actual inflation for the consumers, is more closer to 30 to 50% in that bracket. So it's a lot higher. Moreover, next year, the food producers, because food is like skyrocketing in prices, because it's super dependent on the import, it is not helped a lot by the Russian bank, because Russian central bank was already third or fourth time during this year has raised the base rate on the loans for the central bank, making the effective kind of consumer base rate for the consumer banks, like a business that tries to grow, somewhere around 20 to 25% that rate. And it's really crazy. Like imagine opening a business and 25% you need to be just like a rent. Like this is the profit margin that you need to achieve only to start kind of generating any kind of profit. Basically, it's a death sentence for any kind of potential business growth, any potential ability to have a healthy economy. And looking at all of that, the central bank president, Elvira Nabiullina, stated that we are having the high interest rate in our country because this is what we want, this is what we need, and we're going to keep it high and make it higher if needed until it's necessary. She didn't even say like the outline, the date, and so on, which absolutely inspire confidence. I guarantee you, having a high rate of interest is absolutely inspiring business confidence in your country. I know it's a little bit of an oxymoron, but about Russia and business, but Russia is still run like it's Putin is not doing one of the big dictatorial mistakes that a lot of dictators are doing. Like they are trying to put their dirty hands into the economic framework of the country. For the most part, Putin has not been meddling a lot with the economy. Mostly because he doesn't really like economy. It's too boring for him. That's been known a lot for a long time now. But generally speaking, he's not really delving deep in it. He's still getting his profits for his operations, yes, but the general economy is still being run more or less, not like a market economy, but you get my point. It's still operational. No growth. And that's a big problem. That's a huge problem for Russia. So all of these factors combined, Russia, that was planning a huge increase in the budget for the military expenses next year, is now facing an interesting problem. That all of their projected growth this year that they've reported was a minimal growth. But if you kind of break it down in two parts, where one part is government subsidized growth, mostly like weapons productions, additional increase in factories that are producing completed metal parts, as they are called. I think you can understand what it means. So when you kind of take the military component out of the economy, then the Russian economy this year wasn't really doing that hot. It was at best breaking like to zeros, like no growth at all. That was the best case scenario for the different sectors of the economy that are not military. Next year is looking atrocious. Inflation is higher than in its Ukraine, and Ukraine is in a war state, in a total war state, survival state. It's being bombed every day. Like the fields of Ukraine are full of mines, yet still the inflation rate in Ukraine is lower than in Russia. The sanctions now are starting to really bite because understanding came to the Western powers that we actually need to make good on our words and actually influence. That increases the potential for kind of get around all of these, find additional gray schemes that can boost significant increase for the Russian economy are not really working. The only thing that is operational is maybe staying afloat. But all of that budget, where they're going to be doubling and tripling military spending, with every single passing day of this pressure from all sides applied, is looking that it's going to be just a dream scenario of wishes of a very sick and petty dictator. Thank you so much for watching this, guys. It's Christmas coming. We're going to have a very special stream right after Christmas. I love you all. Stay tuned. Slava Ukraini, and I'll see you next time.